This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On November 6th, Military History Night welcomed British freelance historian and trench archaeologist Andy Robertshaw, who spoke to us about the outbreak of World War I and how it looked to those who participated in it at trench level.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's Military History Night. I'm the event chair, James Ellis. It's great to see another turnout for what is the last Military History Night of the year, but there is more to come next year, so looking forward to seeing you then. Tonight's speaker is a freelance military historian, author, and broadcaster who specializes in the study of the two world wars. A former history teacher and museum director for the Ministry of Defence in the UK, he has written 14 books on military history and archaeology. A familiar face on television in Britain, his credits include Who Do You Think You Are?, Time Team, The Trench Detectives, and the Somme, The True Story. He was a military consultant for the Steven Spielberg movie War Horse, a costume prop and set decorator consultant for Sam Mendes' 1917, and has worked as a military advisor on the films Wonder Woman, The Kingsman, and Mincemeat. In addition to his film and television work, he has supervised more than 20 archaeological projects on the Western Front, with his team having identified a number of them missing. He is still in contact with the families of some of these soldiers who were identified. A member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides, he regularly leads guided tours across Europe. He is currently working on a book about the English Civil War and is restoring a house built in 1830. Please give a warm hand to Andrew Robertshaw.
It's very, very important that if you're a British military historian, you always begin your evening lecture with a joke. My chosen joke is one from Max Miller. Max Miller was a comedian of the 30s and 40s who was eventually thrown off the radio when he made an off-color joke, which you can ask me about later on. I'm not going to tell you what it is now. I'd probably get thrown out by James. But one of his jokes is that actually he said that when he was a young man, he was 21, he came home, he'd walking out with Miss Green. And he said to his dad, "Dad, I'd like to marry Miss Green. Can I marry her?" He said, "Well, look, son, when I was your age, before I met your mother, I had a bicycle. I got around the area. You can't marry Miss Green. She might be your sister." So he was a bit disappointed. So we gave it about 6 months. And he came back and said, "Dad, I've been walking out with Miss Gray. I'd like your permission to marry Miss Gray." He went, "Look, son, I've told you already. When I was your age, before I met your mother, I had a bike. I got around a bit. Can't marry her, might be your sister." So he gave it a year this time, and he went back and he said, "Mum, is Dad in?" He said, "No, he's down the pub." So, "Well, okay, look, I've asked Dad about marrying two girls, Miss Brown and Miss Gray. And on both occasions, he said no, because before he met you, he had a bike and he got around a bit, and both girls could be my sister. And I met this woman, I love her, I want to marry her. And I know what he's going to say." She said, "Max, you marry who you like. He's not your dad." Somebody I know very well went to Staff College in the 1980s in Germany. And at German Staff College, he gave a talk about aspects of dealing with the first Soviet shock army. And at the end of this talk, having started with a joke, the professor of war studies said, "Herr Sheldon," Major Sheldon as he was then, "we don't make jokes about history, military history. It's a too serious subject." So he thought to himself, humorless German bastard. And in the bar that evening, the professor of war studies came in and said, "Can I buy you a drink, Herr Sheldon?" "Yes, thank you very much." "Lovely, I'll have one of those." And he went, "I bet you think I'm a humorless German bastard." And he went, No, I would never think that." He said, "Well, I need to tell you a story." And the story is that in 1948, there's a train going across Western Germany. And on it are three men. There's a young man with a pencil mustache, with a cigarette in an ebony holder. It's got a gold tip to it. It's obviously expensive. There's an older guy who's got a cigar and quite a big, serious moustache. And there's a really old bloke in the corner with a massive white beard and a meerschaum pipe. And the young man says, "I bet you don't know who I am." And he said, "Well, no, we don't know who you are. Well, how would we know?" And he went, "I served with Wittmann, the Panzer Ace on the Eastern Front. I served with him at Villers-Bocage. I was awarded the Paul Marit by Hitler at Berchtesgaden. What about you?" And the middle-aged bloke said, "Well, I was the first officer into Fort Douaumont. February 1916, I followed the NCO in. We captured the fort. I was given the Blue Max by the Kaiser at Potsdam. What about you, old man?" And the old man says, "Well, I was there when we captured the French Emperor at Sedan. I was there when Paris surrendered. I didn't get a medal. I never met the Kaiser. At least we won." See, even the Germans have a sense of humor. So let's start with my story. My story is going to be in a series of chunks. It's not a complete narrative. It's just various bits that hopefully will come together. How does trench warfare come about? We're talking about the Great War, and I've spent much of my life digging trenches, making trenches for Wonder Woman, that kind of thing, building trenches for 1917, digging trenches for archaeology, digging trenches for TV. How does it come about? Well, if you follow the narrative that normally is trotted out, it's quite simple. You see, what happens is that I see you and you see me. You've got a machine gun, I've got a machine gun, so I dig a trench to stay alive. Well, that would make complete sense were it not for the fact that the German army in 1914 advances from the German border through Belgium and through northern France, gets within sight of Paris before it digs in. So what changes? What actually leads to trench warfare? Let's go back to first principles. Let's not worry about why the war happens. It does, okay? What is the war aim of the Germans? Well, the war aim of the German is the Schlieffen Plan. And the Schlieffen Plan might be seen as a warning to the General Staff of what would go wrong if they didn't follow it to the letter. And they don't, by the way. Schlieffen said the sleeve of the most right-hand man should touch the English Channel on the way round. But by the way, the channel isn't English, but I'm just taking possession of it. Okay, the key thing is that actually what happens is that they kind of water it down a bit because they're very worried about what's going to happen in the East. Because what's going to happen in the East is the Russians will mobilize. Oh, hang on. We're back to current affairs, aren't we? The Russians are going to mobilize. Now, Germany can mobilize 2 million men. The French can mobilize 1.7 million. The Russians can mobilize 3 million men. Do the maths on that. You can ignore the Brits, by the way, in this, because we mobilize fewer soldiers than Switzerland, fewer soldiers than Belgium, which is bloody embarrassing. The fact is that what's going to happen is that the Germans need to knock out France in 6 weeks. That's a visual reference to 6 weeks, okay? If they don't, they're screwed. No question. So the railways in Germany run east-west, because that way they can mobilize and the trains are organized so you can basically unload a brigade in about 45 minutes on the French or Belgian border, okay? That's what it's going to be. And then they're going to go basically west. They're going to defeat Paris. Paris will go from being the Eiffel Tower to being like this. That happens in the Second World War, but not the First. You got the idea. And the great joke about this is, what does the mayor of Paris say to the Nazis in 1940? And the joke is always, a table for 100,000, monsieur. The French will lose 500,000 men between the beginning of the war and Christmas 1914. And in 1940, in 6 weeks, they lose 500,000 men. These numbers are staggering. The jokes are off colour, but they're also off the fact. However, the French managed to delay the Germans to such an extent, and the Belgians, bless them, blow up bridges. They snipe at Germans. There are massive repercussions. The library at Louvain is burnt. People are murdered in large numbers. No, monks aren't used as live clappers in bells. Why not? They're too soft. But you got the idea. The fact is that what we've got is a situation where within 5 weeks, the Germans can see the Eiffel Tower. They can smell the Parisian croissant cooking. That's not true, by the way. I made that up, but fine. You got the idea. They're close. And they're on basically the River Marne. And the miracle of the Marne is, of course, that Gallieni mobilizes the 2 territorial divisions, put them into taxis, and sends them south of the River Seine to deal with the oncoming enemy. Can you imagine a Parisian taxi? Hang on. South of the Seine, this time of night, you can imagine. The key thing is, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the Germans run out of time. They also run out of space. They don't have enough men to actually link up from the Swiss border, Toblerones and cuckoo clocks and merchant bankers, up to the North Sea. So what they have to do is to wheel to the south. And when they wheel to the south, there's a great gap opens up. They then dig in on the River Aisne, having fallen back from the Marne. And when they dig in, what they begin is this thing called trench warfare. Why do they dig in? Because they've failed. And they will then be able to fight a war in which the German army can defend, and we, the Allies, Britain, France, Belgium, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, will go on forever if you like, will attack. There is a way of avoiding it. Winston Churchill said, jaw is better than war. We could negotiate. The president of the USA at the time, Woodrow Wilson, suggested negotiation. Agree a ceasefire. It's called an armistice, by the way. We don't do it. The politicians decide, no, we will fight on the Western Front. By the way, the politicians had previously decided the generals weren't as good as they could have been, and they were going to actually invade Turkey, which leads to the debacle of Gallipoli. Having had that failure, they come back and went, well, now what we're going to have is basically a war of attrition, in which the Allies will attack and the Germans can defend. So why is it that German trenches, German pillboxes, German are better than ours? Because the answer is quite simple. The Imperial German army can win the war by staying where they are. Think about Ukraine. The Russians can win the war by staying where they are. The Ukrainians, if they're going to win the war, have to push them back or negotiate. You see where I'm going with this, don't you? The key thing is the Allies will then have to attack, and when we attack, we're always going to go against positions in which the Germans have chosen the most advantageous position. And what is the most advantageous position? The answer is uphill. Why is it? Passchendaele's a hill. Vimy a hill. Well, simple. Because the most effective weapon system in the Great War is a telephone. No, it's not an iPhone 15. It's going to be basically a D3 phone if you're British or Canadian. And what that allows me to do is to be able to tell the artillery behind me what's happening below me. And that means that what I need to do is, if I start a battle to push the enemy back until we get to the point, we get to the crest of the hill, I have not achieved success. There is no point going halfway up the ridge at Vimy, halfway up the ridge at Passchendaele and digging in, because they can still see what we're doing. If the enemy can be pushed back onto the reverse slope, we have pushed them back out of position. What's it called? Well, curiously, In the Second World War, it's called liberation. The army that invades Normandy is the BLA, the British Liberation Army. The army that fights in northern France and Belgium in the Great War is the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, which sounds like something you might use to punish a tribe of Africans in the 1880s. Language is important. Think in terms of Passchendaele, Vimy, and the other battles as being liberation, but also pushing the enemy back so they don't have eyes on the target. Whether it's Hill 60 or Hill 62 or any other of the battles, it's always about hills. And those hills are really insignificant. Hill 60, 60 meters above sea level. Hill 62, 62 meters above sea level. It's really a very small amount of height, but believe me, if you've got eyes on the enemy, you can push them back. So we're in a situation where trench warfare comes about. However, the Germans then attack twice, in big terms, 3 times possibly. Ypres, the first gas attack, it fails. Verdun, February 1916. What's the purpose of that attack? Falkenhayn wants to bleed the French army white. By the end of the battle, the French have lost 1.5 million men dead. They are being bled white. Why do we then fight the Battle of the Somme? Partly to relieve the pressure on the French. Because believe me, if the French had pulled the plug on it, they do in 1940, why did Canada enter the war? Why did Australia send men? Why did Britain send men to die? Because that's it. We cannot fight the war. And that's the next part of my story. We don't have enough men. Now, the other day, I was talking to a group of school children. And I hope they didn't think I was being rude. I'm a Brit through and through. By the way, we almost moved to Edmonton when I was 8, but we didn't. The key thing is that when the war starts in 1914, if you over there are Belgians, okay, and I'll help you here, you're Flemish, there is de Aap is Don LeBlanc, that is, where is the monkey? The monkey's in the tree. That's the only Flemish I know, okay? You're going to be called up when you're 20. You will do 2 years in the infantry, 3 years in the cavalry and the artillery. Why? You need the extra year to learn about horses. Because as early as 1914, many people are not familiar with horses, okay? You're the French army, okay? Bonjour. And the French army, we can have basically, Sange, the Sange of Don l'Arbre. Where is the monkey? The monkey's, it's the same, okay? You got the idea. Okay, you're the German army. I've no idea what the German for where is the monkey, but just believe me, you're Germans, okay? You're going to be called up when you're 20. You will serve then till you're 22 or 23. But each of you, whether you're Belgian or French, will then do periods of training every year to keep you up to speed, okay? You're Germans. You're called up when you're 18. You will go in the reserves. Then you go in the regular army. You will finish when you're 23 or 22. And then you do periods of service until you're 55. Which means in the event of a European war, we can mobilize in Germany 2 million men. Why? Because we call up everybody who's ever served. Not a problem. So whether you're Jacob Honnes or Leopold Rothermel, you will be called up. One was 36, one was 24. These are real people, by the way. We found them in the archaeology. You're French. You're Jean-Claude Leportier from Normandy. You're going to be called up age 52. But you know what you're doing. It's not a problem. You're Belgian. I don't know what your name is. Never found any Belgians, but assume we know, okay? Probably called, if knowing the Belgians, something like Billy, but there we are. You're called up age 26. You know what you're doing. It's not a problem. You go to the casernes, you draw your uniform, you draw your weapon, you go, you're fine, not a problem. You're a Brit regular, 150,000 of them in the BEF. you know what you're doing. Your NCOs may well have served in the Boer War. Some of your officers may well have served 12 years earlier in the Boer War, but you know what you're doing. We've then got the territorials, the reserve forces. We've got about the same number of people, but still it's less than 1/3 of a million men. It's very limited. So what we need are volunteers, okay? And those volunteers on the outbreak of war will come around in Australia and Canada and New Zealand and Britain, and they will volunteer. Like my grandfather. My grandfather volunteered in 1914. I want to be a soldier. With his best friend, William Hughes. William Hughes's son was Ted Hughes, the poet, married to Sylvia Plath. Just a coincidence. But Ted gets in the army because he doesn't have a heart murmur that my granddad got. He wasn't going to join the army then until 1916, because then when he had his medical, his heart murmur had mysteriously gone away. But there we are. It saved my life because he was badly wounded in 1917 in the abdomen. A wound that in 1914 had a 13% chance of survival. By 1917, it's 45%. Thank God for decent surgeons. The key thing is now that on the outbreak of war, you, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Empire, all step forward to do their stuff. But there's a problem. The problem is if you're Belgium or French or German, you can step up to the plate and go, I know what I'm doing. Give me a rifle. Give me some ammunition. Give me my rations. Give me a tent. I can do it. My granddad's battalion, as it became, in 1914 parades. 1,000 men on the outskirts of Hull. The commanding officer steps up and he says to everybody who's paraded, who are largely the Hull commercials, they're managers, they're accountants, they're all those people. How many people here can put up a tent? How many people here can cook over an open fire? And a very small number of guys go, oh, I can. Put your hand down, son. You're in the army. Just say, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can do it. Brilliant. You're now sergeants. That evening, a delegation of basically senior members of the business community in Hull went to see him and said, sir, you cannot make those guys NCOs. Why not? They're the T-boys. Yes, but they're also Boy Scouts. They can cook over an open fire and they can put a tent up. You can't. In other words, we start the war basically with one arm behind our back. That one arm behind our back is not enough men and not enough of a reserve of manpower to be effective. So what does that mean? And don't take this personally. You might do. We can talk about it afterwards over a drink. The first Canadian soldier to arrive at Ypres, January 1915. The first Australian and New Zealand soldier to arrive at Ypres, in Gallipoli, April 1915. The first soldier from India, by which I mean modern Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, when did they arrive? September 1914. Because somebody who has a very bad reputation as Chief of Staff of the Indian Army has carried out a study of what might happen in the event of a war and has decided that as India has a force available of roughly 3 million people, what he can do is say one army will remain in India for civil control. One army will go to the northwest frontier. Where's that? Afghanistan. Does that sound familiar? 3 armies will remain available. One will come to Europe on the outbreak of war. And they arrive at Marseille in late September. They arrive in the trenches in late October. And what that means is that the British Army fighting against the Germans at Ypres by the 1st of November 1914 is 1/3 India. And without those Indian soldiers, we could not have withstood von Kluck's 6th Army. In other words, from the very beginning of the war, the British Army is a multicultural army. Now, if I could take you now to Saint Laurent on Omaha Beach, we could go look at those wonderful cemeteries seen so evocatively in Saving Private Ryan. Cross, 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 Star of David, cross, 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 Star of David. Fine. I could take you to Notre Dame de Lorette, overlooking that great ridge at Vimy that you're so familiar with. It's covered in thousands of crosses and the occasional crescent of Muslim soldiers. Take you to a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery. There may well be a cross of sacrifice in the cemetery, but each man or woman is commemorated with a stone with a curved top and an appropriate religious symbol. Why? Because from the very beginning of the war, we are a multicultural army. We have Muslim soldiers, we have Hindu soldiers. Don't ever tell an Australian there were more Sikhs at Gallipoli than Australians. Don't ever tell them there were more French at Gallipoli than Anzacs, because they get really upset. I give a talk called Taking and Holding Ground. People assume it's about tactics. It's not. It's about the way that people have taken possession of bits of the Western Front or bits of the Great War as being theirs, because somehow it belongs to them. Once again, please don't be offended. There's more Moroccan and Algerian blood on Vimy Ridge than Canadian. They take the top of the hill and are pushed back. They fail. Canada succeeds. But how does Canada succeed? Now, I mean, I don't know. If you're American, you could kind of go, oh, well, it's kind of gumption. It's all this stuff. It's all that outback stuff that we've learned. You know, all of that. It's utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense. Let's go back to where we started. Where did we start? We started with the army of 1914, consisting of men who were farmers and teachers and engineers who volunteer to be soldiers. But they start from a very, very bad position in terms of understanding the nature of war, yes? How long does it take to produce a decent soldier in peacetime? 2 or 3 years. However, that's with nothing getting in the way, like a war. If it gets in the way, it's going to inhibit training. You're going to be learning on the job. You understand what I mean. The British Army on the Somme, why does it do so badly? And you can all go, well, you know, it just wasn't very good. Well, that's almost true. It's the equivalent of asking an amateur team to take on professionals, because that's where we are. The German army know exactly what they're doing, and they're defending. And the British army, made up of plucky amateurs, is doing their best. Why do we attack on the Somme? Well, let's think about it. Why did we go to war? We go to war because Belgium's been invaded. We go to Belgium, we fight at Mons, we retreat, we're beaten out of position. At Mons on 23rd of August 1914, we lose 300 men dead. Oh, not nice, is it? Not great. The following day, the French army in the Battle of the Frontiers loses 55,000 men dead in a day. Why is it? Are they just bad at fighting? No, because they're fighting with 1.7 million and we're fighting with 70,000. You lose 11% of 70,000. You can do the maths on it. Okay, it's not difficult. They're fighting a war with millions of men and they will move massive casualties. The British Army then is in a situation where actually we have to take volunteers and they start coming forward. Men like my granddad, had he not been turned down in 1916, is accepted. And what happens then is they're given limited training, and then they're committed to France and Belgium. Princess Patricia Light Infantry are actually sent in January of 1915, having had limited training, but luckily for them, most of them had served in the Boer War. They know what they're doing. They're pretty good at what they're going to do. And what that then means is that actually we then kind of learn on the job. But the key thing for everybody here is that as the war goes on, that training with machine guns, the training with basically musketry, as we call it, isn't adequate. Why? Because the enemy use gas, and then we have gas masks. Then the steel helmet comes in, and then the creeping barrage comes in, and then cooperation with aircraft, and then tanks come in. So as the war goes on, it just gets more complicated, and we have to train all the time to catch up. We're always playing catch up. And the enemy are, of course, doing very well because they can win the war by staying where they are. The cemetery at Tyne Cot is based on 5 pillboxes, which the Royal Engineers said looked like cottages on Tyneside. That's why it's called Tyne Cot. Why do the Germans put in concrete? Because they can win the war by staying where they are. We have to attack. So the first day of the Somme is a disaster. Question: why do we attack on the Somme to start with? Does Douglas Haig decide that actually, as they say in Blackadder, he wants to push his drinks cabinet closer to Berlin? Amusing, but misleading. The decision wasn't made by Haig. It was made by the politicians. It was made by Asquith and Clemenceau, who had a meeting prior to Christmas 1915, I should say. Tell Haig and Foch and Joffre that we will be fighting a war on the Somme. Why? Because that's where we meet the French. It'll look good when we break through. What's the objective? It's not clear. The objective, as Haig has outlined with General Rawlinson in actually the area of Belgium, is to drive the Germans back off their railway network and to capture the ports being used by submarines. It has a clear objective. There is no clear objective to the Somme, but we might break through. We then have another problem. The Minister of Munitions, Lloyd George, much attractive to working girls, but he'll still manage to be a Prime Minister the following year. He orders the ammunition that we need. Not enough heavy ammunition, not enough high explosive, too much shrapnel. But we've got lots of it. We're going to fire 1.5 million shells, a third of which don't go off. Believe me, I've done the archaeology. And those that do go off are shrapnel shells that explode in the sky. Great, looks fantastic. Kills nobody if they're dug in. Next, Haig in April 1916 says to the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, I don't have an army in France. Oh, come on, try again. What he meant was, I have an army in training. 46% of the men serving on the Somme were civilians in 1914. They're rank amateurs compared to the enemy, who have been soldiers since they were 18 or 20. So on the 1st of July 1916, when we go over the top, why do we fail? Is it because General Haig kills them? Well, he kills nobody. The timing of the battle is chosen by the politicians. The location is chosen by the politicians. The use of ammunition is chosen by the politicians. The undertraining of the men is chosen by the politicians. And then, curiously, after the Great War is over, the then or retired Prime Minister, Lloyd George, simply says, the fault of the war was that of the generals. By the way, he wakes while Haig dies before he writes his memoirs. He's not able to defend himself. Now, let's jump forward by a year. Let's jump forward to 1917. Let's jump forward to a battle you might have heard of. It's called Vimy Ridge, okay? It's part of a bigger battle called the Battle of Arras, in which my grandfather served in 17th Division. Why do I mention it? I mention it because it is so successful, isn't it? You all know it's successful. Why is it successful? Well, again, let's go back to first principles. Well, of course, because Canadians are just brilliant soldiers. They're absolutely superb. Compared to the weedy Brits, they're always going to be good. Well, the answer is that actually in the aftermath of the Somme, there is a meeting put together by Haig, and he sends various people off at the same time to find out how come the French did so well on the 1st of July. Remember, the 1st of July 1916 is the worst day ever for the British Army, apart from the surrender at Singapore that we don't talk about. I don't know why. In terms of loss of life, it's greater, but we'll ignore that, because that might look bad for Winston Churchill. He then sends off people like Arthur Currie. Have you ever heard of him? I think you have. And he sends off Australians and he sends off Brits. And they send them off to the French and say, look, you did brilliantly well on the 1st of July. We do badly, they do bad. By the way, the French never do as well again. The Nivelle offensive of the following year is a disaster, okay? So why is it they do so well? And they go, well, monsieur, basically we're now using new tactics. We're using the creeping barrage, which was copied by the 18th Division on the 1st of July, a division commanded by Ivan Maxey, my favorite general. So we've copied it from the French. We then learn how to organize our platoons, and by the winter of 1917, we have SS-143. Don't get confused by the SS side of it. It's not Schultz-Staffel, it's stationary service, far more mundane. But SS-143 is the use of the platoon in offensive action. What is it? It's a stormtrooper's manual. But unlike the Germans who in 1918 will take 10% of their army and give them flamethrowers and special kit and chocolate and rations and make them brilliant, we say every unit has got to be able to do this. And when we then go into action, April the 9th, 1917, Vimy Ridge is captured in a day and a bit. A brilliant feat of arms, no question. Where has that skill come from? Well, it's come from the previous 2 years in which we were terrible at doing the job. It's come from SS-143. It's come from cooperation with aircraft. It's come from losing the flash buzzer to actually contact aircraft. It's come from the creeping barrage. It's come from the platoon tactics. All of that. By the way, the Brits don't do badly that day, but they have a bigger objective. No criticism intended, okay? You take the Ridge, there's no question. Oh, by the way, then you're able to push the Germans back because you can now observe as to where they are. What will then happen? Hang on. 1917. What's magic about that? Oh, I know what it is. 1914, 1915, 1916. We're not very good, are we? 1917, suddenly we're bloody brilliant. Why is that? Because we've had experience, because we've changed our tactics, because we've learned from our experience in the past how to use respirators, steel helmets, cooperation with aircraft, creeping barrages, all of that stuff. Now, some historians will tell you it's a uniquely Canadian thing. You use it well, but it's not unique. Australians will tell you it's an Australian thing because they want to promote the Australian army. And not very long ago, I was actually in a meeting where someone said to me, wait for it, the Red Baron, was he shot down by a Canadian or by an Australian? And I went, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm a Brit. Find an Australian, argue with them. I don't care. I don't care. He died. That was the end of it. Finished. It doesn't really matter to me. The fact is that what we've got is a success of training and tactics that will take us on to the end of the war. So whether it's actually the crossing of the Canal du Nord, whether it's the advance up to Mons or whatever, it's a culmination. And of course, when it comes to General Currie, nobody really knew in 1916 how many men we would lose on the first day of the Somme. The estimates were around 40,000 men killed and wounded. You're going to go, that's a lot of people, isn't it? A lot of people. 1914, the French army are losing 55,000 men a day. When the news comes through in Paris to the second arrondissement that actually in the paper, the Brits have just lost 59,000 men, a Parisian reading the paper would have gone, well, finally they're playing their part. It sounds callous, doesn't it? But bear in mind, at Borodino in 1812, the French army lost 77,000 men in a single day. No machine guns, no 18-pounders, no 5.9s, no 60-pounders. It's all done with bayonets and swords and muskets. It's the equivalent of, wait for it, a loaded jumbo jet crashing every 20 minutes for 12 hours. That's the casualties. You fight a war with the big boys, you're going to lose big casualties. Now, I now sound callous, but it's not just me. Stalin said, one death in the war is a tragedy for a family. 1 million deaths is a mere statistic. You've got the idea. And the key thing for us has got to be that actually, by 1918, by 1917, when General Currie is told, take the ridge at Passchendaele, he says, I can do it, I will lose 7,000 men. Haig says, without success, taking the top of the ridge, if you ever go there, don't just look maudlingly at the dead in Tyne-Cot. Go to the top of the ridge. The visibility from there to the east is superb. He said, I will lose 7,000 men. The battle that follows, that culminates in early November, results in 7,000 casualties. Currie can now calculate exactly what it's going to cost to do a job in a way that 2 years earlier, a year earlier, would have been a stab in the dark. We now know what it's going to cost. Casualties on the Somme are high. Casualties on the 100 days are twice as high as the daily rate. And what that means is the crossing of the Canal du Nord, that advance towards Mons, the advance that my granddad's involved in, which involves taking an area, wait for it, of standing villages and forests and hills, nothing at all like the flat, wet Flanders plain, means that actually we're able to break the German army. By the 11th of November, they have 1 million deserters. By the 11th of November, they have 500,000 men suffering from flu. The Kaiser has abdicated. And I've got a lovely story about this. The Kaiser went to the Dutch border, got to the Dutch border just after 6 on the 9th of November. And when he got there, basically his equerry went to an electrified gate. Why was it electrified? Keep out, basically, the refugees. Ooh, basically, the Belgians have built a wall. And he went up to the gate and said, I have here Kaiser Wilhelm, King of the Germans. We wish to have, basically, a safe place to leave Germany. And the bloke on the gate, who was a corporal of the Dutch army, went, it's 6:10. We close at 6, come back in the morning. And he spent the night in the car surrounded by his personal escort, and he got away with it. How about that? And the next thing is this. How does the war actually end? It ends with a delegation coming in from the German lines with white flags on the 7th of November. The New York Times, one of their journalists, sees it and announces to America that the war is over. White flags have gone up. It would take actually till the 11th for that armistice to come into place. And what is an armistice? An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. It is not the peace treaty. That would follow. That would be Versailles. And we can talk about that afterwards. But the key thing for you is that actually what it means is that the war will end by agreement. Now, the men that served in the Great War, Canadian, Brits, Australian, New Zealand, Sam Mendes' granddad from Trinidad, believed it was the war to end all wars. My grandfather was John Andrew Robertshaw, conscripted in 1916, wounded twice, gassed twice. He was given a book in 1963, written by a politician who we know are always honest. And the book's called The Donkeys. It said that the generals were donkeys and the men were the lions. And he read it and he gave it back to my dad and he said, Peter, I don't agree. We did our job. The generals did their job. And my dad said, well, Dad, what about the 3rd of September 1939 when Neville Chamberlain came on the wireless to say we were at war with Nazi Germany? He went, then I cried because then my war was futile. But it wasn't our fault. It wasn't the fault of the generals. It was the politicians. And my dad said to my granddad at some point, why did you volunteer in 1914? He didn't have to. He was running a perfectly successful business, sexing and selling day-old chickens. A franchise bought from a Japanese businessman. You couldn't invent this, could you? But there we are. Why did you volunteer? He said, because it was the right thing to do. My dad said, really? So why did you really volunteer? And he said, I volunteered to get the uniform off. He didn't want to be a soldier. Nowadays, we talk about the moral compass, yeah? The moral compass that says it's the right thing to send men and women to Afghanistan, to assist Ukraine. The men and women of 1914 or 15 or 16 or 17 knew, whatever the cost, what the right thing to do was. But sadly, history has now polarized it. Lions, donkeys, butchers, bunglers. We miss the color that is the war. That color that allows us to look at it and go, it's much richer than we think it is. When I worked with Peter Jackson and we put the film of the Great War into color, critics said, well, they've done that so that children will be attracted to it. No, we put it into color because that's how it was experienced. Polarizing it blinds us to the reality. 11.8% of the Canadian Army died. 88% of them came home. On the 11th of November, remember all men, all women, including those that didn't come back. But bear in mind the majority do. And they come back not as victims that many people have chosen to make them. They came back like my granddad, as victors. Thank you very much. Is that I'm more than happy to answer any questions that we have, but having spent a lifetime firing muskets, Make it loud, otherwise I won't hear a bloody word, okay? You should probably go, I'm a bit deaf, okay? So, any question? By the way, don't ask me where babies come from, because I don't know, okay? Anything else? I have a final joke, by the way, if you want. Should we do the final joke now? Yeah. Okay, right. My favourite comedian came home. He went to do a matinee, Saturday morning matinee, does the show, and he thinks, well, tell you what, Max Miller, I'll go to the pub at lunchtime. Why not? I'll have a couple of pints, put my head down. In the evening, I'll be sober. So he goes to his local pub, goes in, and publican says, Max, because he was well known, before you have your pint, just so you know, that very handsome milkman that's moved into the area has made love to every woman in the street apart from one. He puts his pint down and he goes home and he says, darling, I understand that really handsome milkman who's moved in, delivering milk in the area, has made love to every woman in the street apart from one. And I'm so proud. And she said, yeah, I bet it's that stuck-up bitch 179. That's my Max Miller joke to finish. So, any questions? Oh, you've gone very quiet. Oh, gosh. It's scary. Okay. There isn't a test, okay? I know I'm a teacher, but there is no test. Yes?
So I understand you've worked on both 1917 and Wonder Woman.
Yes.
Can you compare the two experiences?
Okay, I got the job on Wonder Woman because the previous guy had problems. Gal Gadot's costume, the leather costume, was very tight, okay? And she had to be helped into it, and he had very cold hands. I have warm hands. And it cost, yeah, £300 a day, but I thought it was money well spent, frankly. No. Okay. Right. The two films are interesting. 1917, Sam Mendes, I was able to research Alfred Mendes, Sam Mendes' granddad, found out that he was half Trinidadian, half Portuguese. He had a girlfriend in France who was called, Le Petit Portugais. He was not white, but curiously had no problems coming to London and going to the main recruiting office and saying, I'd like to join the army. Recruiting officer said, yes, who do you want to join? He said, well, I want to join the Rifle Brigade. And they went, sure. And frankly, he, as a non-white guy, straight in to the Rifle Brigade. So really interesting that actually there was no colour bar. Okay, he was straight in. Ask me about Walter Tull in a minute. The thing about Wonder Woman is it's a fantasy. So when somebody from Goldsmiths University said on YouTube that the tactics weren't very accurate, for God's sake, the woman's deflecting machine gun bullets with gold bracelets. You know, it's not so. You just got. My wife hated the film, by the way. I liked 1917, but there were problems with it, and the problems were you're there as a consultant, and a consultant is somebody basically who uses your watch to tell you the time. In the case of movies, whether it's Steven Spielberg or Peter Jackson or Sam Mendes, they'll listen to you if they want to. If they want to ignore you, they'll ignore you. I was saying earlier on, early in the scene when Blake and Schofield are being asked to go off and do what they're going to do, basically he says to Blake, pick a man and come with me. And he says, yes, Sarge. Well, in the British Army, there are only two Sarges. That is a massage and a sausage. Yeah? It's Sarge. Despite the fact that I wrote on the script, no, they put it in there. Later on, there were other things that were utterly useless. For example, if you're a pilot in an aeroplane, okay, flying over the Western Front, you have no parachute, okay. Your aircraft is hit, it bursts into flames. You can drop from 7,000 feet to the ground, basically turning into a rotisserie on the way, yeah? You carry with you a pistol because you can put it under your jaw and blow your brains out. You can spend the entire journey from the sky to the ground slashing your wrists with a knife. You're still awake when you hit the ground. They gave him a knife because it was more visceral. Yeah? It was nonsense. And again, you're ignored because that's what they want to do. So the two films, one is a fantasy, the other one is what the director wants to see, whether it's realistic or not. And it is fascinating. And in terms of then, just I mentioned Walter Tull. It may not be a name that's familiar with you. Walter Tull was an international footballer before the First World War. He was also mixed race. Born in Folkestone. Oddly enough, he was a Bernardo boy. His brother was adopted. He wasn't. How about that? You know? Anyway, he then goes on to play for Tottenham Hotspur. He then goes on to play for Northampton Town. He goes to Argentina. He plays there. And on the outbreak of war, he volunteers. Brilliant. Now, the point about that is, then what happens is his team says, you can't volunteer. You've got to finish the season. He finishes the season. He joins the army. He goes to France as a sergeant. He's then wounded. He comes back to the UK. And the British Army has no problems promoting him to an officer. He then goes to Italy. He comes back to the UK. No, my apologies, he doesn't. He comes back to France. And there he actually dies on the 22nd of March 1918. And the number of people have written up Walter Tull as being the first British officer to actually be promoted, the first to be killed. The first British officer who was black to be killed died before Walter Tull joined the army. How about that? It's nonsense. It's mythology. In the same way as that the youngest British soldier to be killed in the Great War, that's you, is Private Condon. You've got to be careful when you're teaching kids because they think it's funny. Okay, Private Condon, age 14. How did you get in the army? I'm 19 years old, sir. You know, you're in the army. If you look at your attestation papers, even the Canadian ones, it says apparent age. If you say you're 19, you're 19. Okay, I can't do a Google search. The oldest soldier to die in the British Army, sorry to pick on you, is Harry Webber, who was 67, which frightens me. How did he get in the army? I'm 49. He was killed. The average age of the soldier in the Great War in the British Army is 26. The average age of soldiers in the Canadian Army is 27. That's the Great War. Average age of soldiers on Juno Beach is 24. Average age of soldiers in Afghanistan is 22. And yet we've got it around our necks that they're all young. No, they get younger over time. They're quite a mature army, to be perfectly honest. And yes, you can find people who are underage. The one thing you know about any underage soldier, he was a liar. He lied about his age, and that's the case. And certain people who should remain nameless, Richard Van Emden, oh, I named him, bugger, have written books about the underage soldiers, and there's about 100,000 of them, of whom about 50,000 serve in France. During the course of the Great War, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand Army is 6 million people. It's a tiny fraction. So we cannot take them as being representative of the British or Canadian soldiers. That is not the case. Okay. Any more questions? Yes.
So when a Canadian looks at the war, they see Curry, Canadian Corps, they're daring and dashing, and they're the cream of the crop. And when the Aussies look at it, they see Menage and the Aussies, and they're the dashing shock troops.
Yeah.
From a British perspective, how would you interpret it?
Okay. It's very simple. Some units in the British Army are very good. My grandfather's division in 1918, I have no hesitation saying 31st Division, their reputation is formed on the 1st of July. On basically 7:30 on the morning of the 1st of July, they are the 31st. By about 10:30 in the morning, they're the 30 worst. They will never get any better. They are shockingly bad. The 18th Division, a new army division, do very well. Next, just as an example, if you're Canadian, if you're Australian, if you're New Zealand, you cannot go to a British unit. You have to be held to replace the casualties from a Canadian unit or Australian unit or New Zealand unit, which means they're always up to strength. And in January 1918, British divisions go from having 4 battalions in a brigade, basically 4,000 men, to 3,000 on the premise that actually we don't need that 4th battalion because now we've got Lewis guns and other weapons. The Canadians don't. The Australians don't. I am a staff officer looking at who I'm going to send into action. Yeah? The mathematical side of that is, yes, we know that they're good. We know that they can do the job. But more importantly, there's lots of them. Yeah? And they can do the job more effectively because there will be overwhelming numbers. Whereas my granddad's division, frankly, it's shockingly bad. It's massively under strength. And frankly, we just don't have the ability. Some units do. Guards are pretty good. 18th Division, pretty good. 29th Division, you might be familiar with, pretty good. Other units, 51st Highland Division, very good. Some of the others, 47th Division, 46th Division, I should say, very bad reputation until 1918 when they take the bridge over the Canal du Nord. And then suddenly they go, but they've had time to learn what they're doing. So I think it's not a matter of basically British generals looking at Empire forces, Commonwealth, and going, well, we'll just throw them away. It's more a matter, this is the objective, we need to take it. Curry can do it, yeah? The Australians can do it. Our guys probably can't. Yeah, does that make sense? And it can be taken from the other angle that we're throwing away lives of men that we don't value. I don't think that was the case. Now, that argument could go both ways. But bearing in mind that Australian, Canadian, New Zealand units are always up to strength and British units are massively under strength, particularly because Lloyd George doesn't allow reserves in the UK to join the army in France. What then happens is on the 21st of March 1918, when the Kaiserschlag hits, we are very largely overwhelmed. But as the 1 million men available are released and the age for men to serve in the army drops from 19 to 18 and a half, which it does in April 1918, suddenly we're up to strength, we have the men, and what we then get is the 100 days. And as I said before, my granddad's unit ends up basically on the edge of the Ardennes at the end of the war. I went there on November the 11th, 2018, and I was stunned by the forest. I was stunned by the houses that predate the war, because by that stage the Germans have been driven back. The miracle, as it were, of the 100 days is we know what we're doing, we've got the men we need to do it, and we are using modern tactics. Basically, maneuver warfare is born in 1917, and we'll see its apogee in 1918 with the defeat of the German army. Yes?
You spoke well about how politicians got in the way. Are there some good examples from the Great War of where they got out of the way and let the generals do their job?
There are some. I think what we get is a situation where in 1918, when it all goes horribly wrong, Haig, having been criticized at home, says, I will resign because I will take responsibility. And the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, says, oh, you can't. You got to stay. And he stays. And then when Haig dies far too young, in my opinion, then Lloyd George writes his memoirs and said it was all his fault. Amazing, you know. So that's a good example of a politician not being prepared to take responsibility. I think that's my best example of that. And again, during the war, you know, choosing how the generals should fight the war is very largely made by the politicians. It doesn't happen with the Germans. Basically, the Kaiser doesn't have to answer to Parliament, and he's very happy to deal with Falkenhayn and later on to deal with the other senior field marshals, who then run him in a way that would not happen in a democracy. And we have to remember, it is a democracy. You know, the generals are not in charge. It's the people that the people have voted in. In that case, if anybody would like a book, I'm more than happy to sign it. And I will now stand aside.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.